There's been a lot of speculation about the North American Hopewell being the people of the Book of Mormon. While my own research places Book of Mormon territory in western New York, not more than 80 miles from the hill Cumorah, who their Hopewell neighbors were created a whole new area of study for me. And as my research expanded, the answers came, some of which I'll share with you in this video. For instance, in Barry Fells, America, BC, we learned that as far back as 1000 BC, Celtic mariners arrived from across the Atlantic and colonized areas from the West Indies northward to New England, where they built villages and temples, raised druid circles, and buried their dead. Other foreign mariners arrived at various intervals thereafter. Thus the Nephites and Mulekites were not the only people in the land when they first arrived, having settled a land they called Zarahemla, not far from the hill Cumorah itself in western New York. Three things in particular help archaeologists identify the ancient inhabitants of the land: language, DNA, and the shape of the skull, all of which follow certain family lines, and each of which will be used in this video to help identify the North American mound-building cultures, particularly those of the Ohio Hopewell and any tie they may have had to the people living in neighboring New York among the Nephites and Lamanites. As to the actual lands of the Book of Mormon, this video focuses on western New York, for by careful attention to the scriptures, each and every land, city, and sea noted in the Book of Mormon can be laid out in the western New York landscape exactly as outlined in the scriptures. This video is for those who question how the Nephites and Mulekites living in New York fit into the overall picture of the mound-building cultures when only a relatively few burial mounds were found in New York. To answer that question, we need to start from their entrance into the land and go from there. The scriptures tell us that the Mulekites came across the bones of the Jaredites as soon as they arrived. Thus we can suppose that after an Atlantic crossing, they sailed down the St. Lawrence River directly into Lake Ontario and stopped along its southern shores just to the north of the hill Cumorah, which they then dubbed Desolation. Not surprisingly, archaeologists found evidence that a company of people arrived in western New York out of nowhere around 600 BC, a people with a round skull type typical of the Mulekites' Jewish ancestries, who fled Jerusalem around that very time in history. In fact, it's not improbable that it was the Mulekites who built the city of Mulek and named it after Mulek before moving north up the Buffalo River, a river they subsequently called Sidon, and settled what came to be known as Zarahemla after the people who first brought Prince Mulek to the land. Alma tells us that Zarahemla itself, at least those local lands surrounding their capital city, was located along the River Sidon. The River Sidon in this setting matches in every way western New York's Buffalo River, with its shipping port as busy a place in ancient times as it is today. The archaeological record shows the Mulekites settled both western New York and lower Ontario, where the Algonquin language originated. In time spread west across the upper Great Lakes, where they became the rootstock of the central Algonquins in both Canada and the northern fringe of the United States. While the Mulekites' area of greatest concentration remained in Canada, border tribes moved south around the Great Lakes, where they became prominent members of what has become known as the Hopewell culture, 90% of which were brachycephalic, or those with a round skull type typical of the Jews. While the Mulekites were led to the lands in the north, the Nephites arrived in the lands further south, having likely sailed up the Susquehanna River and from there into southwestern New York and ultimately north into Zarahemla among the Mulekites. The Lamanites living in New York became the rootstock of the later Iroquois tribes, with both the Iroquois and Algonquins carrying the X-DNA haplogroup with its ties to ancient Israel at frequencies as high as 25%, with the Iroquois' western two cousins carrying it at 15%. The land south was thus called Lehi, and the land north was called Mulek, which was after the son of Zedekiah, for the Lord did bring Mulek into the land north and Lehi into the land south. Well, it is readily accepted that a number of races were involved in the traditions of the Hopewell. Who the general populations were remained a mystery until 2001, when a team of specialists in the study of DNA concluded that the Hopewell were linked genetically to the Proto-Algonquins living around the Great Lakes. Their movement into southern Ohio is well documented, with James B. Griffin of the opinion that the culture in Ohio was so attractive to the people in the north that there was an actual movement of some of them southward into Ohio, where they blended together to produce the Ohio Hopewell. Is it any wonder that a mound in the shape of a Jewish menorah and oil lamp showed up in Ohio during the Hopewell era? The arrival of the Mulekites in Ohio added such a fluorescence to the local mound-building Adena populations that archaeologists began to refer to this merged culture as the Hopewell, after a farm where some of their artifacts were found. The archaeologist Don Dragoo noted that the Eastern Point Peninsula people, meaning those Jewish Mulekites living in neighboring New York, were never to become active in or share the full fruits of the Ohio Hopewell culture, which their Western cousins were to establish after their intrusion into the Adena area. The Mulekites now living in Ohio inherited a stratified political system based on class distinction from the Adena, something totally abhorrent to the Nephites back in Zarahemla, who preached against such discrimination. It was the hierarchy in the Hopewell who were buried in the great mounds scattered across the land, not the local populations. Tribes further south also made inroads into Ohio, where they also influenced the budding Hopewell society, and not for the better, having arrived from the Tennessee-Cumberland area, where a major sun-worshipping culture lived. By following the scripts they left behind, which Barry Fell then translated, it appears that around 250 BC, Phoenician ships brought Celtiberian traders across the sea, where they settled along the New England coast and then westward through Pennsylvania into West Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, where a large population grew up, drawn chiefly from native Iberians of Celts and Basque. The merged Celts and Iberians were the most influential ethnic group in Iberia when the Mediterranean powers of Carthage and Rome started their conquest. Many of the Celts among them were of Hebrew ancestry through Israel's tribe of Dan, who became a seafaring people after leaving the main body of Israel, with some partnering with the Phoenicians in many of their seafaring adventures. The script found among the skeletal remains in the Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia, once deciphered, tells us that the men interred there were Phoenician navigators, with the script found written in Punic Phoenician, which modern language scholars confirm can be tied to the Celtic and 2nd century BC Hebrew Phoenician language. An identical tablet was also found in West Virginia, with another in Tennessee and a third in Ohio, where they have been associated with large burial mounds resembling those found in Iberia during the Bronze Age. The Druid priests the Phoenicians always brought with them may well have been the Antichrist noted in the Book of Mormon, for they continually challenged the very heart of the Christian faith. The men of the Druidic order took on the roles of priests, teachers, lawyers, and philosophers, many of the same professions noted among those who espoused the order of Nahor in the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon story of Alma and Amulek, who went up before a judge who was after the order of Nahor for preaching the gospel of Christ and were ultimately imprisoned, reveals the striking similarities between the order of Nahor and the Druidic order of Celtic Britain and Ireland. In Alma 14 we read, "And when they had been cast into prison 3 days, there came many lawyers and judges and priests and teachers who were the profession of Nahor, and they came in unto the prison to see them, and they questioned them about many words, but they answered them nothing." The Celts who settled to the south of the Nephites in West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee were a round-headed people, totally unlike the narrow-headed skull type typical of the Nephites living in New York and Pennsylvania. Field researchers say the Longheads waged war with the Roundheads for many years in their efforts to protect their homes and villages to the east of the Ohio and Scioto rivers. Because of such strong resistance, The Roundheads simply opted to move north into Ohio and Illinois, for nothing barred their way in that direction. Though that some bands of these well-known robbers, which was a common trait among the Celts, did manage to sneak into Nephite territory. In 3rd Nephite we read, "And it came to pass that the 93rd year did also pass away in peace, save it were for the Gadianton robbers who dwelt upon the mountains, who did infest the land. For strong were their holds and their secret places, that the people could not overpower them. Therefore they did commit many murders and do much slaughter among the people. And it came to pass that in the 94th year they began to increase in a great degree, because there were many descendants of the Nephites who did flee unto them, which did cause much sorrow unto those Nephites who did remain in the land." Once the sun-worshipping Celtiberians entered Ohio, the Hopewell culture changed again, with great ceremonial centers aligned and sun, moon, and stars now beginning to dot the landscape. The Celtiberians and their Druid priests began the construction of great ceremonial centers based on the alignment of the stars, something the Druids were especially known for. In all, Druidic knowledge consisted of natural history, astronomy, mathematics, geometry, medicine, jurisprudence, poetry, and philosophy, with philosophy and astronomy practiced with rigid exactness. Please don't be confused in your thinking regarding these magnificent ceremonial centers, which some have suggested were Nephite temples, for they've been identified as lunar observatories, which archaeologists such as S.D. Peet and others tie to similar structures in Celtic Britain and Ireland, where their Druid priests were experts in astroarchaeology. It is believed that around the 1st century or shortly before, the sun-worshipping cultures from Florida and Mexico's Veracruz also began to influence the Hopewell. New discoveries of Mexican-styled artifacts have recently been found in Hopewell mounds, showing a definite tie between the people of both regions. As the southern tribes who built large pyramid-type structures and platform temple mounds began to migrate up the Mississippi River, the Hopewell too came under their influence, and temple mounds began to dot the Ohio Valley as well, with sun and serpent worship prevailing, not the worship of the Savior. Then around 34 AD, the long-awaited time of Christ's arrival among them had come, a time of both terror and glory, for the Book of Mormon tells us that a terrible tempest and earthquake destroyed the more wicked part of the people, which we could take to be those steeped in sun worship, with those that remained about to experience the greatest event of their lives, a visit from the risen Lord. With the visit of Jesus Christ to America after his death and resurrection, peace entered the land, and a new religious fervor was initiated which lasted for 200 years. During this period of peace, the Nephites and Lamanites walked the land freely, and the Hopewell trade network flourished and spread from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. The Hopewell were now free to trade well beyond the Hopewell heartland. Copper was brought in from the upper Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, with volcanic glass and grizzly bear teeth brought in from as far away as the Great Rocky Mountains, where some even settled. Unfortunately, peace did not last indefinitely. The old decadent ways of the Hopewell began to take root again and filtered into New York around 160 AD, where the scriptures tell us the Nephites began to divide into classes, and to wear pearls and costly apparel, and to build up churches to get gain. The scriptures tell us that it was the rising generations who succumbed to the decadent ways of the Antichrist in the area, who were even practicing human sacrifice, an evil which ultimately brought down the wrath of God on the whole area, starting with the Hopewell. And since the Lamanites were proving to be more righteous than the Nephites, the Lord used the Lamanites to clean house. Thus, around 350 AD, the Iroquois and their southern Cherokee brothers, both of which worshipped the Great Spirit above all, and had enough of their decadent ways, began to cleanse the land of the Hopewell, with those not killed in battle sent on a long migration into Mexico. By 385 AD, they turned on their own Nephite brothers, all too many of which had also embraced the wicked ways of the Gedians. Thus they disappeared as well in a war of complete extermination, with the Lamanites coming out the victors. Only Moroni was left after that terrible battle at Cumorah, who then wrote the account of that terrible time in history on golden plates for those of our day. Over 2,000 years have come and gone since that terrible time in history. The lands around Cumorah are quiet today. Streams no longer flow red with blood, and the landscape is once again in bloom. Yet the bones of the dead cry out from the dust to those of our day to take care lest we too lose our place in the promised land because of sin. Only their bones are left to tell the tale of their life and times. But what a story they tell, a story found only in the Book of Mormon.